We're in Daf Mem Hey Amid Beis, and we're studying the sugya of a different kind of bittul in chametz, which is not the classic bittul of I declare that all my chametz is like after diara, but rather a bittul in which I designate my chametz for a certain function. It's part of a kli and it strengthens the kli. I intend to leave it there on a permanent basis. And that we had in the case of the Areva. And then you can have a different kind of bittul where he designates it as a moshav, as a seat. And in those cases, he's not chayv in bir. Then we had a discussion yesterday about the case of an achsadra. And this discussion about an achsadra was in the context of what we call tziruf chatzoi zaysin. So you have a half a zayis of botzeik in the house. You have another half of zayis of botzeik of chametz in the achsadra. If they were two chatzi zaysim in the same bias, that's called a tziruf. We combine and integrate the two to form one full kizayis, because the assumption is he cleans up his house and he connects and he gathers together all these different pieces of chametz. But what about in the case of the achsadra? Is that considered also part of the bias? Does it have the same halacha? And the Gemara tells us here on Daf Mem Hey Amid Beis that we can speak about an achsadra as shtei batim or as one bias, zeh bifnim mizeh. And the Gemara leaves this as an open question unanswered. Then we had the case of a pasha ipsa. This loaf of chametz has already begun to spoil. However, although it's not edible for human consumption, it still is royal achilas kelev. So it has that in between kind of a status. And we suggested, based on the famous principle in the Gemara in Chulin of nevela ruya leger, kriya nevela, nevela shena kriya leger, ena kriya nevela, that once it's nifsal miachilas adam, it no longer has the status of macholas asuros. However, in the case of chametz, the picture changes. And we mentioned the name of the Gaonim yesterday and the Rif, that even if you have nifsal me'achilas adam in the case of Pasha Ipsha, nevertheless, you still would violate the Isur Chametz and the still Chiv Biur, and that's because it's Roy L'Chamer Bo Isas Acheros, and that gives it the status of Sior. Other Rishonim would argue that the principle of nifsal me'achilas adam doesn't apply to chametz. You need nifsal me'achilas kelev because you have to be mafkia not only the shem ochel, but moreover you have to be mafkia the shem chametz. And if it's still royal achilas kelev, then it has the shem chametz. The brayso that we studied yesterday establishes that such a pasha ipsha, which is edible for an animal, has the status of an ochel, and therefore it's mitame bikibetza, which is the shear of tumas ochlin. However, the brayso quotes a dissenting view of Rabbi Nassan, and he's of the opinion that once it's nifsala me'achilas adam, this pasha ipsha, then it's not mitame. It's outside of tumas ochlin and poka shem ochel. So we're going to begin today with Tanur Rabbanan, where we left off yesterday. And you'll count up from, the bottom of the Amud. We'll count up together 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 lines up from the bottom. Tanur Rabbanan. Arevas ha'abdonim. Abdonim miloshan ibud. And ibud is the Hebrew word for tanning. So these are tanners that they take the hides of animals and they process them through what's called ma'abed, which, by the way, is one of the 39 malachos of Shabbos, but that's not relevant to us today. And he has an areva. Areva is a bowl, and what they do is they fill up the bowl with water. They soak the hides in this bowl of water because by softening them, it's much easier to do the tanning process. And now, shenosan lisocha kemach, as part of the process, the chemical process of tanning the hides, they add, of all things, flour into this mixture. Now, this has water in it, and it also has hides in it, oros, with an ayin, oros. The mixture between the flour and the water creates chametz. So nischametz hakemach. But on the other hand, he's not designating it as an ochel. He's using it for the process of tanning. And the Brisa establishes that there's a difference between how many days have passed since he put in the kemach. Even though this chametz is soaking together with hides, it still is considered chametz until a 3-day period passes. But once the 3-day period passes, then you would say that it's now no longer edible. And during this process of soaking, the chametz becomes nifsal. But toshlo shiyom, if it's within the first 3 days, it has the shem chametz chayv levaya. Even though, again, inside this bowl, you have not only the chametz, but you have soaking the hides. Kodem shlosha yomim, if let's say 3 days before Pesach, let's go back to the 11th of Nisan. So he puts in the kemach into this concoction, into this mixture on the 11th of Nisan. So he's got the 11th, the 12th, the 13th, and the 14th. He's got more than 3 days before chametz becomes chametz. Eino chayiv levayer. Why? Because then we assume that there's already what we call a kilkul hachametz by virtue of the very bad smell. And Rashi says that the kilkul hachametz is not a result of the hide itself, even if he removed the hide, but as long as the kemach is soaking in the areva is the kli that's designated for ibud oros, then the kli itself has such a strong negative odor, a foul odor, that it causes the chametz to be inedible. So that if this process was begun as early as 3 or more days before Pesach, then when Pesach comes around, he's not obligated in beer. He doesn't have to destroy it. That is the view of the Tanna Kamma and the Brisa. Rabbi Nosson, when do you tell me that he's parted from beer because he put in this mixture 3 days plus before Pesach? But within the period of 3 days, he is chayv levayer. That's shelo nosan letocha oros. Aval nosan letocha oros afilu toch shlosha yomim eino chayv levayer. And Rabbi Nosson is of the opinion that this distinction between toch shlosha or before shlosha, according to which within Shlosha Yomim, you require biur. That's only because the oros are not mixed in. So all you have is the foul odor, as we said, coming from the walls of the kli itself, the reach hakli. But if you have another factor, and that is the oros inside, then the existence of the oros, together with this kemach, together with this chametz, in the same areva, that is mevatel lechametz mitoras chametz, simply by virtue of the fact that it's soaking in this bowl together with oros. So whereas the chachamim hold that the existence of the oros is irrelevant, what determines whether it's chametz and chayv bir or not is the shlosha yomim, because the chachamim estimated, they evaluated that it takes 3 days for the reach hara of the kli to enter into the chametz and remove and undermine the shem chametz, the Torah's chametz, and that's the way the halacha was set up. Shlosha yomim, you have to be mavayir, but kodem shlosha yomim, you don't have to be mavayir. And it's possible that the chachamim hold that by soaking the kemach in the areva, which has a reach hakli, and you do so 3 days before, that's considered your biur. That is your fulfillment of biur chametz. You now have done something, set up a process by which the chametz is going to receive the smell, the odor of the kli, and therefore that's considered as if you destroyed the chametz. But once you already have chametz entering into this 3-day period, then you need real biur. It's not enough to set up the chametz in such a way that it would smell funny and therefore you mafkir the Torah's chametz. The 3-day period already establishes a chovas biur on this hefza, which you cannot remove. And Rabbi Nassan has a different view. Rabbi Nassan is of the opinion that it all depends upon whether you can have a process by which the chametz loses its taste. And therefore, if you put in the oros, even within 3 days, which means that you already entered into the 3-day period, you're on the 12th of Nisan, the Chacham would say now the chefta is already nitfas in a chovas biur, and Rabbi Nosson says no, we still allow you that time period before the actual chovas biur is chal to be mafkia, to remove the Torah's chametz by soaking it in oros. Now, I'd like to share with you a note here on this Gemara, and he says the following, that from the presentation of the sugya, especially the way Rashi interprets it as we presented it, it seems that although he had placed the oros into this concoction, which according to Rabbi Nassan is enough, is sufficient to be mafkia the shame the Torah's chametz, nevertheless, adayin lo nifsal me'achilas kelef. The oros, with all due respect to their very powerful odor, etc., it still is edible to the dog. And how do we know this? Well, keep in mind that we had Rabbi Nassan in the previous brisa, and he was of the opinion that once the pasha ipsha, going back to that case, was nifsala me'achilas adam, it's not metami tumas ochlin, meaning pakashem ochel. How much more so pakashem chametz? If it's not even an ochel, you can have something that's metami tumas ochlin, but it's not chametz. But to say that it's not metami tumas ochlin, it doesn't even have the bare bones basic. What else could I add that starts with a B? Entity of a shem ochel, then for sure it's not chametz. And if that be the case, then Rabbi Nassan, in the case of oros, doesn't have to go as far as to say that it was already nifsala miachilas kelev, it's dayenu if it's nifsala miachilas adam, because that's already mafkir the shem ochel. It's not metami tumas ochlin, and hence it's not chayv and beer. It doesn't have a Torah's chametz. And if that be the case, if we're talking about a mitzias where it's still edible to a kelev, despite the fact that he added the oros, we now go back to the shitas chachamim, and we can now shed a whole new light on why the chachamim are not impressed with the fact that he added the oros into the concoction and it's soaking in oros, because still it's royal achilas kelev, and the chachamim hold that in that state of royal achilas kelev, it's asur in chametz, meaning it's chayiv in biur. And we explained that because of the brayso that we had earlier on this daf of royal chamebo isos acheros, and that's the new category, which is not really chametz, but it's called CR, and CR is something which can be mechametz and used as a fermenting agent. That itself gives it the shame isu. Hence, if it's not posel miachilas kelev, then we understand that he's chayiv in biur. The chachamim establish a whole different halach over here, and that is that the reach hakli, if you placed it in the kli already 3 days plus before Pesach, that's enough to be mafkia the shem chametz. And we have to understand how that operates, because according to the chachamim, if it's not nifsal me'achilas kelev, then it should be included in the chovas biur. And here we're saying Ton Rabbanan arevas ha'abdonim shenasan l'tocha kemach is toch shlosh yomim chayav levayer. However, kodem shlosh yomim eino chayav levayer. And that means even though he didn't put oros in there, so it's not soaking in the hides, and it's only an issue of reach hakli. If it's still royal achilas kelev, then the question arises: why is it eino chayav v'bir? And he goes on to say that we should connect our brisa that we're studying now about the arevas habdonim with the brisa that we had with regard to a kupas, and that brisa recorded a machlokus between Rabbi Elazar, Reb Shimon ben Elazar, and the Chachamim. According to, just to review, Reb Shimon ben Elazar, in a case of a kupas where he designates the chametz, the batzek, as a chair, as a seat, the halacha is that even if it has a kizayis, nevertheless it's batel. It's not chametz at all. And perhaps that's what's going on here in the case of Kemach, in the Arevas Abdonin. We ask the question, well, wait a minute. If there's no oros soaking in, and the Chachamim say that if it's Kodem Shloshim Yomim, it doesn't require beer. But even though, despite the fact that it is royal achilas kelev, why shouldn't that alone be sufficient to be mechayev him in biur? He has a chovas biur here simply because it's royal achilas kelev, which we saw in the previous brisa in the case of Pasha Ipsha. And the answer is that perhaps our Tanakama in this brisa of Arevas Habdonim is none other than Rabbi Shimon ben Elazar. Rabbi Shimon ben Elazar says that kupas, no matter what size the chametz is batel mitoras chametz. It's not chayiv in biur. Here also, this is parallel to the case of kupas. Why? Because he's using and designating this kemach, this chametz, as an agent for the purpose of ibud oros. It no longer is in the realm of chametz that's meant to be eaten. It's like the chametz kupas of Rab Shimon ben Elazar that's designated as a piece of furniture. Here also it's not a piece of furniture, but nevertheless it is outside the realm of chametz. But then he says the following, very interesting. Even the Chachamim who disagreed with Rav Shimon Elazar in the case of Kupas agreed, if you recall, that if he was tach paneh betit, if after he set up this little seat made out of batzek, he put on a layer of concrete or some sort of a muddy substance which dries, then it's eino chayav b'biur. Therefore, he suggests yesh lomar shegam tanakama cholik al Reb Shimon Elazar v'sover shelo moil bitul b'kupas. In other words, kupas designating as a kupas in and of itself is not a bitul to remove the shem chametz. Yodu kan or Yodeh kan, the Tanakama of Shimon ben Elazar would agree here in the case of Areves Abdonim. The Kevon Shenisinas Ha'oros B'mayim, initially he soaked the hides in this water together with the kemach. Again, he took out the hides, but obviously he put it in for some amount of time. I don't know exactly what the minimum amount of time is until it softens up the oros. Havile kitach paneh betit. It's parallel to the case of the kupas with the additional proviso that he added a layer of tit. And that's already considered bittul, even according to the Tanakama of Reb Shimon ben Elazar in kupas. Hence, our case where he put in the oros into the concoction, even if the oros were taken out after I don't know what time, that's equivalent to tach paneh betit, and that constitutes a bittul, but only if it's going to continue soaking for another period of 72 hours minimum. So it comes out that according to this interpretation, which I'm not sure who he's quoting here, honestly, I think he says this is Rebbe Elchanan and Kovet Shiurim, if I'm not mistaken, but be that as it may, there are two variables here that seem to combine A plus B. What you have is the soaking in the kli. The kemach with the mayim is soaking in the kli, and it's absorbing that foul odor from the kli. And that's going on for a period of 72 hours. Now, we're going to ask the following question. Is it royal achilas kelef? And the answer is obviously yes. It's still royal achilas kelef. And that's the chiddush here of Rab Nosson, because Rab Nosson is of the opinion that once it's nifsal me'achilas adam, it's paka shem ochel, and therefore in chametz it's not chayv in biur. So why is the soaking process of 3 days sufficient, according to Chachamim, to embrace the position of eino chayv in biur and accomplish bitul mitoras chametz, if it's still royal achilas kelef? So Rebbe Elchanan is suggesting that we have another variable to add to the equation, and that is that at the beginning of this process of soaking, the tanner added the hides themselves. That already is like the case of some of chametz that was dedicated for some purpose, taking it out of the realm of an ochel and doing another action to sort of, tighten the screws, which we saw in the Tanakama of Reb Shimon ben Elazar in the case of a kupas, where he designates the batzek as a seat, but then he went a step further and he was toch aleh betit, in a sense, really changing the whole designation of this batzek. Maybe perhaps before toch aleh betit, he could change his mind and he could decide that he wants to fry it in the, in his frying pan and make latkes out of it. I don't know. But once he was toch aleh betit, that's final. That's, irreversible. And the parallel case would be putting the oros into the kemach. But again, this is the point that has to be ironed out. You have a combination of two factors. And he writes here, Tzarech Lomid Shegam L'das Rabbi Nosson, Al Yidei Shrias HaOros, is Nifsal HaKemach Me'achilas Adam, V'lo Me'achilas Kelev, U'machlokas Rabbi Nosson V'Tanakama Hayim Tzarech Levar Chomit Shenifsal L'Achilas Adam, meaning that it's still Roy L'Achilas Kelev, and that's going to be the Machlokas Tanoim. Amar Rava, Halacha ki Rabbi Nosson, Afilu Yom Echad, Afilu Shah Achas. Now, this gives us a clue as to the ambiguity that we mentioned before. At the beginning of this process, we said he soaked it with oros. And Rabbi Nosson says that how long of a time period did he leave the oros in the mixture? Says Rava, 1 day is enough, or even 1 hour. And now you get the impression that the Chachamim hold you have this absolute requirement of 3 days before Yontif. As we said before, once you enter into the 3 days, that's already the Chefza, the Chametz is Nitfas B'Chovas Bir. And now you have to undermine the Chovas Bir. To undermine the Chovas Bir, you would have to soak it in oros. But if you place the oros into the concoction before 3 days, that's already considered Torah's Bittul, even according to the Chachamim, the Tanakama. And that could reflect, as we said before, the Tanakama of Shimon ben Elazar in the case of Tochel Betit Bekupas. Rabbi Nosson says that I don't care about the 3-day period. All I care about is adding the oros into the concoction. What is Rabbi Nosson saying over here? You could argue that Rabbi Nosson is saying that the oros adds such a strong negative element here into the equation that you have not only the kli, which has a reach ra, but now they have the oros itself, that now the chametz became nifsa. Then we're saying that according to Rabbi Nosson, the kelev could still eat the kemach. But I'll prove it to you. Says Rav, if Rabbi Nosson was talking about soaking the oros for a full day, then it's quite possible that the full day has that impact of completely, making it in nifsal me'achilas kelev, that very profound repercussion. But no, afilu sha'achas. Sha'achas is not going to be enough to have such a profound impact on the batzek, on this mixture of kemach and mayim. So what's the sha'achas? And the answer is that the adding the oros into the mixture is already halacha bittul, not bittul because of the lack of a tam, because again the kelev is going to eat it. That's enough for tam chametz to make it into a shem chametz according to Rabbi Nosson. However, adding the oros is itself an active bittul, so to speak. He actively redirects the function of this kemach. It's no longer in the realm of chametz. Okay, Rabbosai, that completes the sugya, or at least that part of the sugya that we started 2 days ago. But now we want to focus on a different dimension of our Mishnah. The Mishnah seems to postulate an analogy between the laws of chatzitza and the laws of bir chametz. And the Mishnah's language is v'chein le'inyan tumah. That just like with regard to chametz, the question is, he's got these pieces of batzek that are trapped in the crevices of the areva. Does he want to get rid of them and remove them, prong them out? Or on the contrary, he would rather that they stay, and plug up the crevices of the kneading bowl. And now the Mishnah goes ahead and says that that distinction between whether his intention is to take out the botzik or to leave it there, has the same, is relevant and is koveh the law in the same way. That distinction applies in the same way to chatzitza. And in chatzitza, we're going to wonder whether or not he wants to keep this botzik in the sedek, in the crevices, and then it becomes part of the kli itself. So it's no longer a hefsek, a chatzitza separating the water of the mikvah from the walls of the kli, because now the botzik is sort of part of the kli itself. Or he's makbid and he wants to get his intention is to take out those pieces of botzik that are trapped in the crevices, because that's not chaz, it doesn't help at all. Let's say to the side of the kli, top of the kli, whatever the case may be. And in such a case, since he intends to remove it, it doesn't add anything to his kli. He's makbid on it, and it's a chatzitza. There's only one major problem, which seems to blow up the whole thing out, torpedoes the whole analogy here between chametz and as far as beer is concerned, and a piece of chametz as far as whether it's a chatzitza. The Mishnah differentiates between a botzik, which is more than a kazayas, and that which is less than a kazayas. Meaning, again, it depends on the different lashonos, but let's go according to one lishna, that if there's a kizayis b'makom echad, in one particular crevice, there's a full kizayis worth of botzik, then all these distinctions fall off. Yechayev in beer absolutely automatically, even if his intention is to allow the botzik to stay in its place, and it is beneficial for the function of the areva, because it has a kizayis. And that would apply in the case of dofnei areva. You remember that distinction between the shulei ha'areva, where he's preventing the water from seeping through the holes in the crack on the bottom of the areva, as opposed to the dofnei areva. In the case of the dofnei areva, we need two conditions in order to be mafkia and chovas bir. Number one, it's got to be chazi le, lekayim es hakli, right? Well, what's the language? I forget.
L'chazek.
L'chazek, is that the language? Just 1 second. I think there was another word. All right, it's not so relevant. We know what we're talking about, but asui. Okay, asui l'chazek. You're right, l'chazek. Asui l'chazek. So that even though it's asui l'chazek, and it helps you during the process of lisha, so that the dough, when it rises, it doesn't end up in these cracks, which are now plugged up by the botzik, by the chametz. But nevertheless, that chazi or asui lechazek is only mafkir the chovas biur if it's less than a kazayas. Now that distinction between more or less than a kazayas makes sense when you're talking about macholas asuros, because the Torah gives chashivas machila to a chefta of a kazayas. But such a distinction doesn't seem to have any bearing or any logical relevance to the case of chatzitza. Chatzitza should depend upon one and only one factor, and that is kpeda. Is he makbid or is he not makbid? So again, reading the language of the Mishnah, v'chein linyan tuma makbid ol of chotzeitz, v'rotze b'kiyuma areu ke'areva, and the Gemara now wants to clarify this v'chein linyan tuma. The word v'chein sounds like we're equating the laws of and the status of the areva when it has these, pieces of butzik stuck in the stocking, and whether or not in tuma considered a chatzitza, is he makbid on the butzik, is he not makbid on the chatzitz, and all this is being equated to the case of chametz. So the Gemara asks immediately the question, midami, how could the Mishnah presuppose an analogy, an equation between the din of the Batek as far as Hilchas Chatzitz and Tuma is concerned, and the din of the Batek as far as Chametz Linyan beer is concerned, Hasam, with regard to Chametz as Machalas Asuros, B'Shiura Talya Milsa. We understand that the halach of beer depends on whether you have a kazayis or you don't have a kazayis. A kazayis of Chametz gives it a certain chashivus, and if he eats it, he violates the Yisra Achilas Chametz. Hence, he's got to destroy the Chametz. So we understand and appreciate very well the distinction between a kazayis b'makom echad and less than a kazayis b'makom echad. But hacha, in the case of tuma of chatzitza, b'kapeda talya milsa, everything hinges on one factor: is he makbid or is he not makbid? Does he want to leave the batzek in the sedek, or does he want to get rid of the batzek and take it out of this crevice? What difference to make what the size of the batzek is? In Hilchas Chatzitza, you have a kli, let's say a sheretz fell into a kli, and now you have to put the kli into a mikvah. We just have to know if there's a chatzitza. Now, again, I'm not going into the whole distinction between rov and makpid and this, that, and the other thing, but fundamentally, if you have a chatzitza, means that part of the kli, whatever part of the kli it is, cannot come in direct contact with the mime of the mikvah, then the tefillah is a tefillah psula. You can tell me he's not makbid. Okay, if he's not makbid, from his perspective, let the batek remain forevermore in the crevices of the kli. But if he's makbid, then it's going to be a chatzitza. The issue or the dimension of achos mikazais or more than a kazais is totally irrelevant. Amar Rabbi Yehuda, you got to change the gears of the Mishnah. Emo, perhaps we should suggest Ula inyan tuma eino kain. That whereas chametz Pesach depends upon the shear of kazayis or less than a kazayis, as far as tumah is concerned, on the contrary, that distinction is totally irrelevant. It makes no difference whether it's a kazayis or less. All it depends upon is kapeda. And this is very exciting, except for one problem. I mean, are we willing to change the girsa? Well, Abaye is not so excited about changing the girsa. Amalei Abaye turns to Rabbi Yehuda, and he says, "Vaha v'chein le'inyan tuma ktani." It doesn't say ula inyan tuma eno kain, but rather it says v'chein le'inyan tuma. The Mishnah is definitely transmitting some sort of an analogy between the laws of chatzitza and tuma and the laws of beer and chametz. El Amar Abaye hachi ka'amar. This is what the Mishnah has in mind. V'chein le'inyan siruf tuma. Here we're going to turn to Daf Mem Vav. V'chein le'inyan siruf tuma b'Pesach. Now this is really fascinating because what Abaye is postulating is that, you know what? Pesach is actually a factor that has to be considered in this equation of Tumah and Chatzitza. Bishar Yemos Hashana Ika Plugta. Plugta here means a distinction between whether he's makbid or not makbid, and the only relevance here is whether he's makbid or not. And if he's not makbid, that means it's rotza b'kiyumo, it's asu l'chazek, and it has the status of the areva, and it's not a chatzitza. And that distinction between whether he's makbid or not, which is now the only exclusive factor that determines whether it's chatzitza, that's true for shar yemos hashana. However, and this is really, I'm always nispal from Abaye. I don't know, I'm a big Abaye fan. One day in my life, if I ever finish Shas, I want to do a research project on Abaye. I have a feeling that Abaye is the most conceptual of all the Amaroi. And he's not impressed by technicalities. You know, he climbs up to a different sphere. Anyway, he says, Hechidami, Yigon de'ika pachos mikabeta ochlin, inagu Behai Botzek Bepesach. Here's where there's an overlap between the Chiyuv Bir or the absence of a Chiyuv Bir in Chametz on Pesach and Tumah vis-a-vis the halacha of Chatzitza. He's got a piece that is less than a kibetza, and if it's less than a kibetza, then it's not Matami Tumas Ochel. The shear of kibetza, the minimum shear for an ochel to be an ochel in Tumah is a kibetza. But Nagu, that ochel came in contact with high botzek, with chametz. Now again, in the case of chametz, to generate a shem chametz, it has to have a kizai. So we have a kizai of chametz that comes in contact with ochel, which is less than a kibetza. And here's the distinction between the 7 days of Pesach and the rest of the year. Bi Pesach, the isuro chashiv mitztaref. Since the isur chametz on Pesach, which means that a kizayis of chametz, even though it's less than a kibetza, is chashiv, it's chashiv that it generates a shem isur chametz, and now he's got a botzek of a kizayis' worth in the areva, and it's not bottled to the areva, because we said that once it has the chashivas of a kizayis, it's not bottled to the areva. And that was the language, if you remember the Mishnah says, Im yesh kizayis b'makom echad chayav levayir. So in other words, if it's less than a kizayis, then we can apply the principle of bittul, meaning it's bottled to the areva, and it's not chametz. But if it's got a kizayis worth, then it's chashiv, and it's not bottled to the areva. Now, says Abai, mitztaref. We can now integrate the botzek in the areva to the ochlin that's less than a kizayis, and now, less than a kibetza, and we can be mashlim. Now we can complete the shear of a kibetza, such that now the ochel will be makabel tumah. In a case where it was tar and something tameh comes in contact with it. But even though he's not makpid on this botzek that's in the areva, he has no interest in removing it from the areva, and therefore you and I would have said, well, in such a case, therefore it becomes bottled to the areva, and if it's bottled to the areva, then it's not mitami tumas ochlin. And moreover, it has less than a shear of kibetza, which is the minimal shear for tumas ochlin. It says Abai Nen. That's not going to be the halach. That botzek will be makabel tumah if it comes in contact with whatever, with a sheretz, whatever it might be. And the reason for that is because it gains its chashivos even in the absence of a kibetza, and even though normally we would have said it's bottled to the areva, because it now became combined, so to speak, connected with a kizayis' worth of chametz. And that's what happens on Pesach. But b'shayimos hashana, where the kizayis does not generate any isur and therefore doesn't generate any chashivos, is then b'kpei the talya milsa. Then echinami, you just have to ask one question, and that is this botzek botel to the areva, or is it not botel to the areva? Does he want to keep it there, or does he want to get rid of it? Then im makpid olav, then we're going to say mitztaref, and it could be mitame. Why? Because since he's makpid, therefore he wants to take it out and eat it. He doesn't want to waste this botzek in the sedek because he doesn't have any interest in it staying there to be machazik the kli. But rota b'kiyumo, if he wants to keep it in the kli, in the areva, arehi kareva, and then we're not going to be mitzaref it to the ochel that touches it, even though that ochel would have a shear of kizayis, but during Shayimos Hashana, the shear of kizayis doesn't give generate any chashivus because there's no shema Easter that's chal the rest of the year. And therefore, since he's not makbid and he wants to be makayim and in the kli, therefore it's not mitztaref to the other ochel of a kezayis in order to be mashlim the shir of kibetza. Maskifla Rava, very typical dissenting view, or shall we say, objection to Abaye. Mi ketani mitztaref, v'achotzeis ketani. Does the Mishnah say that if he's makpid olav, then it's mitztaref? Meaning, according to you, Abaye, the thrust of the halacha here is the halacha of tziruf. That since he is makpid, now we want to know whether it's metami tumas ochlin. We're not talking about whether it's a chatzitza or not. Certainly, if he's makpid and he doesn't want it to be part of the areva, it is a chatzitza. And therefore the mayim of the mikveh did not come in contact directly with the kli, that's for sure. But you're telling me, Abaye, that the equation to chametz b'Pesach is not because of hilchos chatzitza, but rather because of hilchos tumas ochlin. Namely, do we integrate the batek that's in the sedek of the areva together with other ochlin that come in contact with it in order to be mashlim the shir? And then the Mishnah's Iker Chosim in Sefer, it should have said something about being mitzarev, and the language of the Mishnah would have been in makbid olav mitztarev. Meaning that since he is not being mevatel into the kli, he has all intention of removing it. And even though if the sheretz falls on it, it's less than a kibetza, but the answer is it came in contact with chametz b'Pesach. And that chametz had a shir of a kezayis. The shir of the kezayis gives chashivus because it generates the shem Easter chametz. And now that chashivus is transferred, is superimposed on the less than a kibetza of ochel, which he's makbid on, to create a kibetza's worth of ochel that now is roy lituma. And why? Because of the chametz that has a kezayis worth and generates a chiyuv of chametz during the course of Pesach. Elam Rava says if you're going to be loyal to the language of the Mishnah, you can't change it in such a radical way and say that we're talking about tziruf to another piece of ochel for purposes of being mashlim the shir of minimum shir of kibetza. So we go back to our original position that v'chein linyan tuma, the language of our Mishnah, is referring to being mitayr the areva, and you have these crevices in the areva that are filled in with batzek with chametz. And the Gemara now explains what Rava has in mind. What's the case? Kigon the itame high areva. Right, so sheretz falls into this bowl, and the bowl now contracts tumah. Boilat bule, now he wants to be matbil the kli, the areva, in a mikvah to be mitayr the areva. The Pesach, the isur of chashiv, he has a kezayis' worth of batzek in the areva. That makes chametz into chametz as far as the Easter chametz is concerned. That gives it chashivus. And now it's no longer batel to the areva. So we're talking about the overlap of the following factors. Number one, the areva was makabel tumah. And now, number two, he wants to be tovelin in a mikveh to be mitayr. Number three, he's got batzek that's caught in the crevices of the areva. And number four, it's Pesach. And now, although you might have said, well, he's not makbid on it. Therefore, the botzik should not serve as a chatzitza, but that's only to remove chashivus. And now we're going to put back the element of chashivus based on the fact that it's Pesach and it's chametz and it's chayiv and biur. Now, you could understand this sugya on a very simple level, and you might say that since there's a kazayas' worth of botzek, even though he's willing to be mavatal and he's not makpid, but nevertheless he's got to get out that botzek and destroy it, or take one of these. We call it a brenner here in Israel. I don't know what they call it in English, but anyway, and he's got to blowtorch it and burn out this botzek. So he would normally, if it wasn't Pesach and there wasn't a chametz and biur, he would be satisfied to leave the botzek in place and let it add something and enhance and strengthen the kli. But he's got to get rid of this chametz, this botzek. Why? Because it's Pesach. Is therefore chotzetz. The botzek is considered a chatzitza, and therefore, since it's Pesach, lo salkale tvila. So the process of mikvah is not going to be mitayer the kli because he has a chatzitza. And what makes this botzek into a chatzitza? Not the fact that he wants to get rid of the botzek. He wants to keep the botzek there. He wants it to become part and parcel of the areva, so it shouldn't be a chatzitz. But the answer is because it's chametz with Pesach and it's got a kazayas' worth, therefore it's chashiv. And once it gets a chashivus of the isur chametz, the mela becomes a chatzitza. It's amazing because we have here an overlap of two different worlds of halacha. One is the world of macholas asuros, and the Torah says with regard to chametz on Pesach, you need biur, you got to get rid of it. And the other is the world of chatzitza. And you would have said there's no interplay between the two worlds. Nay, there is a very important interplay. And as a result of the isur chametz and the chiyuv biur, it becomes choshev, and now it is a chatzitza. If on the other hand there's no shem chametz with an iser and a chiyuv biur, because we're talking during the rest of the year, the balance of the year, is bekveda talia milsa. He makbid alav is chotzetz v'im rotza b'kiyumo hareu ka'areva. If he's makbid, he wants to get it out of there. He wants to remove the botzek. Then in such a case, it's a chatzitza. And that would apply even if there's no kazayas. So this is b'shar yemos hashana. Everything is reduced to one question only. Is he makbid? Is he not makbid? If it's rotza b'kiyuma, he wants to leave the botzek there in place in the sedek, then hareu ka'areva becomes part of the kli, and it's no longer a foreign element, and it's not a chatzitz. And this would apply in the case of makbid, even if it's less than a kazayis. Maskifla Rav Papa. Rava, you think that you have progressed and you're closer to the language of the Mishnah than Abaye was. You rejected Abaye because it didn't say in the Mishnah, in makbid olav mitztaref. So what do you have instead? You have chen le'iyan tara. Where does it say that in the Mishnah? Maskif lo Rav Papa. Meek, Tony, does it say in our Mishnah v'chein le'iyan tara, meaning tara in a mikvah, tefillah in a mikvah? Ha v'le'inyan tumah, Tony. The language of the Mishnah is v'chein le'inyan tumah. According to you, Abaye, Rava, it should have said v'chein le'inyan tara. Tara meaning the process of tefillah. Elo Rav Papa. You know what the Mishnah means when it says v'chein le'inyan tumah? V'chein le'inyan lahorid tumah la'reva. In other words, a Dover Mitame came in contact with the Areva, and the issue now is whether or not the Areva was contaminated. Did that sheretz convey tumah to the Areva? Hechi dam. Kigon to Noga sheretz b'hai botzek. Interesting. You have in the Kli an area, let's say the Kli is I'm just making this up, it's silver, but you have a wide area of chametz. And that wide area is where the sheretz fell. So the sheretz came in direct contact with the botzek, according to Rav Papa. And what's going to be the deal? Does the Areva receive tumah? Here's what the deal is. If this happened on Pesach, the Isuro Choshiv, that the Kezayis of Botzek is Choshiv, and it's not bottled to the Areva, then Chotzetz. Now, let's be careful here. The word Chotzetz is not to be identified with the Chatzitz of Rava, meaning as far as Tefillah is concerned. The Chotzetz here means separating the sheretz from the Kli. Because as we said before, the sheretz only fell on the Botzek. In such a case, Chotzetz, there's a Chatzitz between the Areva and a sheretz, v'lo nachtola tumah, and therefore the sheretz does not convey tumah to the Kli. And this would apply even in a case of Eino Makpid Olav, meaning he's Rotza B'Kiyuma on the Areva, he wants it to stay in the Areva. It's not considered like the Areva itself, v'lo nachtola tumah. We view the Botzek, despite the fact that he intends to leave it there and strengthen his Kli, as a separate alien element. And we can now limit the Tumah when the sheretz falls on the Botzek to the Botzek itself. That's only because this Botzek has a Kezayis and it's Pesach. And now there's a certain element of separateness, that this Botzek is separate from the Kli, even though he's not makpid on the Botzek. And why is this chametz, this Botzek, something special? Why does it get its own status, such that now it could be a chotzetz and prevent the tumah from penetrating into the Kli? And the answer is because of the Isur chametz. There's a kezayis of chametz. But b'shayimos hashana, where you're allowed to hold on to this Botzek, the Bikpeda Talia means that the bittul of the Botzek to the Areva depends totally on his Kpeda, is then in Makpid Olav Chotzetz, the Rotza B'Kiyumo Hareu K'Areva. So during the rest of the year, the entire issue of whether or not this Botzek is a separate entity and therefore prevents the Tumah from being transmitted from the sheretz to the Kli, that will depend upon Kpeda. If he's Makpid, then that's good news for the Jews. Again, it would be making it into a Chatzitza and Hilchas Tefillah, but as far as being a Chatzitza and separating and wedging between the sheretz and the Kli itself, it is a separation, and it is a chatzitza. And why? Because he's makpid olav. He wants to get it out of there. He wants to take some sort of a utensil and remove the Botzek from the stocking. And because he's makpid, then it's a separate entity, as we said, and protects the Kli. And again, that would be even if the Botzek has less than a Kezayis. but he's makbid, and therefore it's not bottled to the arev. But im rotza b'kiyumo, if he wants to keep the butzik in place there in the crevice, then harehu ka'areva, then it becomes part and parcel of the areva, and when the sheretz falls even on that part of the butzik, the entire areva is contaminated, is makabel too. So both say this leads us to the next Mishnah, which is here in the middle of Daf Mem Vav Haman Aleph Butzik HaCheresh, the deaf piece of chametz. We'll try to figure out why do we expect a piece of chametz to have a power of hearing, and what's a deaf piece of chametz? Okay then. So thank you very much, and everyone should have a great day.